During the months of June to July 2011, on board the ill-fated squid jigging vessel YV001E, there occurred one of the worst non-sinking related maritime disasters in modern times. A labor dispute arisen between subcontracted workers and the squid jiggers management team led to a violent uprising, and subsequent events led to the loss of 22 lives. All 11 survivors were convicted of murder. What could have motivated one man to start this bloodshed? How can you avoid and foresee dangerous circumstances yourself? Please make sure to check out our book in the link below. We will take you on a journey of alternative views on human nature. Lu Guiduo, age 27, born to poor villagers, he completed only middle school education prior to entering the workforce at age 15 or 16. Lu's known to have worked in various menial occupations in farming and construction. Despite being born to impoverished origins and lacking in education, Lu is known by fellow villagers as a sharp person and exhibits high emotional intelligence. A fellow hijacker later recalled Lu as being more mature than the rest of us. Prior to the ill-fated journey on YV001E, Lu has had no criminal records and is known as an honest worker who never stirred up trouble. In Lu's world, there were very few ways for uneducated people from impoverished backgrounds to make money, and most importantly, to accumulate savings at the end. One of the few options available was to work on a long-range squid jigging vessel on year-long contracts, where you are obliged to remain on the ship for as long as 1 to 2 years under squalid conditions and subject to bullying by the captain and his team. The expected annual income at sea will both be higher and more stable compared to working on land, and it is hoped that under the prison-like conditions on board, there will be no opportunities for squandering money. So in theory, at the end of the year-long contract, each sailor will end up with significant amounts of savings after getting back onto land again. A popular long-range fishing destination at the time was to the coast of Peru and Chile, where large amounts of jumbo squids could be caught. Reaching there is an arduous journey of 2 months long, over 17,000 kilometers. The squid jigging vessel could continuously remain on the Peruvian and Chilean coast for more than a year, as newly caught squids are constantly loaded onto dedicated purchaser ships sailing back to China, while dedicated supply ships keep the jigging vessel supplied at sea. Lu soon found employment via a labor agency to work on board the squid jigger YV001E, owned by Rongcheng City, Sinfa Aquatic Food Products Limited. The YV001E was built around the year 2000. It is 37 meters long and 7 meters wide, and displaces 233 metric tons. There are ample fuel and provision storage on board for ocean-going operations. The YV001E is capable of lodging at least 34 people during long voyages at sea. It is known to have had 4 separate rooms for cabins and still have spaces left for a separate kitchen, mess room, and dedicated storage spaces. Due to the need to attract squids with lighting illumination, shifts will always begin at night time and last up to 18 hours into the following afternoon. The work on board entails high physical demands, where teams of 2 are expected to manually lift jumbo squids weighing up to 50 kilograms from depths of up to 100 meters. Once lifted on board, each squid will need to be cut up and portioned into pallets of 15 kilograms each, where it will be carried into the freezer compartment below decks. The newly enlisted crew members were led to expect an annual base salary of 45,000 Chinese yuan, or $7,500 in 2010 values, with the possibility of performance bonuses based on the amount of CAT. If the expected income were to be true, it would be a generous sum for menial work without educational requirements. Unfortunately, there are clauses in the agreement that were overlooked by most of the new crewmen. The misunderstanding of the employment agreement will eventually lead to the horrific events on board later on. When the crew began assembling in November 2010 at Shidao Port, there were 34 sailors in total. Most crew members were from the various northern provinces of China. The average age of the sailors was 35, while the typical educational attainment was only middle school, with the exception of recent university graduate Ma Yuzhao. The crew members were clean of criminal records, with the only exception being 47-year-old Xiong Lishan, who was charged with theft in the past. Most sailors came from relatively poor backgrounds, with the exception of 20-year-old Huang Jimbo, whose family was fairly well off and had real estate and cars in the capital city Beijing. He dropped out since middle school and craved adventure. Many of the newly recruited seamen had debt to repay due to failed businesses and various poor life decisions. All in all, the average circumstances of those on board were not great, and choose the job out of desperation. After the assembled crew moved into the ship, an ominous event occurred on the first night. The chief cook, surnamed Yan, started shouting "Murder! Murder!" while roaming through the various cabins of the ship. Li Chengquan, the captain, soon berated Yan, who soon became quiet and sat down. Just when everyone assumed Yan had calmed down, he had in fact jumped off the anchored ship. Yan was soon rescued by a nearby fishing vessel and sent home. In the following days, a new crew member Xia Qiyang was hired to replace Yan as chief cook of the ship. Ironically, Xia became the first victim to die on board the ship months later. When Yan's family members were interviewed about the event, it was said that Yan had developed mental health issues after his mother passed away. Despite the family's explanations for Yan's behavior that night, it is likely that experienced sailors like Yan had witnessed high-pressured abuse or even murders on board ships over the years, which could have gradually traumatized him. It is common cliché amongst fishermen in China, at the time, that murders in the open seas do not get caught. There are scarcely enough law enforcement to monitor people in the open seas, and murdered sailors are often excused to have fallen overboard. Besides Chief Yan, another sailor who had exited the ship prior to departure was Wang Shubin. Wang's sister became weary after reading the employment agreement and talked Wang into going home. When interviewed about Lu Gui Duo after the tragedy, Wang recalled an episode where 10 or so sailors went on land to eat out. Lu footed the entire bill of 1,000 yuan and told the others not to worry about it. As a gesture of kindness, Lu Gang, Wang's close acquaintance on board at the time, once warned that Lu is a tough nut to crack and that there was something different about him. Lu Gang indeed became one of Lu's victims during the journey. Of the 33 sailors that eventually went out to sea, 21 of them can be classified as belonging to 3 social cliques centered around home provinces or cities of origin, while 12 people have no clear group affiliations at the beginning of the trip. The 3 social cliques on board are primarily organized around the provincial and city origins of the sailors. They are: 1. The Dalian clique, centered around Captain Li Chengquan and the ship's management team, average age, 39.5. 2. The Inner Mongolia clique, centered around Bauta, at least 4 or 5 members are ethnic Mongols and spoke Mongolian amongst themselves, average age, 27. 3. The Heilongjiang clique, centered around Lu Gui Duo, with Zhang Xiaolong and Lu Chengjian as his right and left-hand men. The 3 had known each other prior to boarding the ship and are an extremely tightly knit group. There were many other close personal relationships at the start of the trip. The notable ones include: Chief Officer Fu Yizhong had been close friends with Captain Li for 20 years. Second Officer Wang Yongbo had been close friends with Captain Li for 10 years. Chief Engineer Wen Do and Third Engineer Wen Mi are cousins. Second Officer Wang Yongbo is Seaman Wu Guoji's brother-in-law. Wang Peng and Wen Do were classmates from driving school. Wen Do, Lu Gang, Zhang Shutao and Yue Peng are close and formed a subgroup within the Dalian clique. Social influence on board the ship is hence centered around 4 men: Captain Li, Chief Engineer Wen Do, Mongolian Bauta, and primary antagonist Lu Gui Duo. The ship spent most of November and December docked in port. Time was spent on logistical tasks such as stocking up on provisions, ship maintenance, and crew training. In an unexpected move, Lu Gui Duo brought 165 boxes, equivalent to 1,650 packs, of cigarettes onto the ship. There were so many that the cigarette boxes had to be loaded up to the cabin ceiling. Lu had managed to unconventionally obtain the cigarettes on credit from the fishing company. This could be seen as another sign of Lu's uncanny ability to get things done his way. Lu purportedly said, "I don't know what the fuck to expect on board this ship, but I will treat myself well on cigarettes." Due to the limited space on board, the fishing company, who also sold Lu the cigarettes on credit, did not permit any additional cigarettes be brought on board. Lu therefore monopolized the cigarette supply on board the ship. Survivors later recounted Lu Gui Duo offering free or discounted cigarettes to selected sailors and gradually succeeded in winning favors. During the 2 months on shore, Lu succeeded in befriending Wang Peng, age 24, and Huang Jimbo, age 20. Both had found that the 27-year-old Lu is an elderly brother figure and closer in age to socialize with. Lurong U-2682 set sail on the night of December 27, 2010, together with 6 other fishing vessels belonging to the same company. There were 18 new sailors on board, including YV001E, whom did not have the seaman license to legally work at sea. The company was aware of this, and arranged for lone sailors to temporarily fill up positions on the Lurong U-2682 in order to get past the authorities' head count. After the authorities completed their head count and license checks on board the ship, a small boat then sailed to the Lurong U under cover of darkness and swapped back the actual sailors who were slated for the trip. During the 2 months' journey to the Peruvian coast, relationships on board were amicable. Much time was spent on cards, gambling, talking, and boasting about spending the money earned after returning to land. Meanwhile, YV001E wasn't exactly like the rest of the sailors. One survivor recounted Lu jotting down notes. When asked about what the notes were, Lu muttered they were navigational coordinates. There's always something mysterious about Lu's character. Others cannot discern what he was truly thinking of at any moment in time. Lurong U-2682 finally arrived near Peruvian waters by the end of February 2011, and squid jigging operations commenced almost immediately. For the ordinary seaman on board, squid jigging was simple but physically demanding. Captain Lee is a tall man with a bad temper. He once punched seaman Bao Cheng in the eye for sleeping on the job. Whenever mistakes were made, he would frequently slap sailors on the head. Whenever arguments arose between the management team and the sailors, Lee would always favor his people. During interrogations, survivors often blamed Captain Lee's heavy-handed management style as contributed to the tragedy on board. Harsh rules such as no talking and no smoking during work was enforced with violence. When 2 sailors fell ill during March to June, Captain Lee even contacted the company to freeze their monthly salaries. As time passed, the new recruits on board gradually resented the work and management style on board the ship. When the Lurong U's freezer holds are full, purchaser ships will be arranged by the company to pick up squid pallets at an agreed-upon coordinate on the ocean. Seamen will then take turns to stand inside the freezer compartment and lift 15-kilogram squid pallets up onto the deck, where another seaman will carry the pallet onto the purchaser ship. While inside the freezer compartment, the workers were each expected to lift up to 50 pallets out before switching. Shorter workers such as Duan Zhifang had a hard time during his turns in the freezer compartment. And YV001E was known to have helped Duan raise the pallets up in his typical selective acts of kindness. The replacement chef Xia Yang was a jumpy character. He had a tendency to bluff, and flattered the captain often. Being aged 41, he always used his supposed seniority to talk down on younger sailors. Some loathed him as a result. Zhang Xiaolong, YV001E's right-hand man, once got into a quarrel with Xia after having drank too much, and tried to jab at Xia with a knife. After other sailors pulled him away, Captain Lee slapped Zhang in the face and threatened to fire him. Zhang responded by kneeling in front of the captain begging him not to. It is assumed that this event built up a feud between Zhang Xiaolong and Xia Qiyang, which cascaded into a series of murders on board the ship. Income was dispersed by the company into onshore bank accounts on a monthly basis. The bank accounts are often shared with family members back home. Sailors also get the opportunity to call home using satellite phones once every few weeks. It is during this time that rumors began spreading amongst recruits with regards to the employment contract. Instead of the base annual salary of 45,000 yuan they were led to believe, the actual income dispersed was based on the monthly catch records at 0.62 yuan per kilogram. Throughout March to May, YV001E had consistently caught the most squids out all the workers, despite this being his first time at squid jigging. Lu's catch records were 4,142 kilograms in March, 2,973 kilograms in April, and 6,793 kilograms in May. Even with this top performance, Lu's income only averaged to 2,854 yuan per month or 34,000 yuan per year if he managed to keep pace, while barely earning back the cigarettes he bought on credit. On top of this, the captain also revealed the possibility of freezing income if a worker is unable to work due to illnesses, as proven by the 2 workers who already fell ill on board. The recruits cannot figure out how the contract's promised figure of $45,000 a year could be realistically achieved, and discovered another clause under the addendum section showing an actual base salary of 1,000 yuan per month, or 12,000 yuan per year. Later investigations revealed Lu Gui Duo's attempted reaching out to the captain about inconsistencies in the employment contract. Captain Li revealed that since Lu and the recruits were not licensed sailors, they were essentially illegal workers, hence no other ship would dare to take them back to China. They'd have to remain on the Lu-Rong-Yu whether they like it or not. After reaching a dead end with Captain Li, Lu Gui Duo discussed with those close to him on the possibility of suing the company. Later investigations revealed this route is blocked off as well, since unbeknownst to the sailors, the seal on their employment contract had been forged. One day Lu Gui Duo was exploring his lawsuit ideas with seaman Duan Zhifang. When asked how he planned to get back home, Lu purportedly mumbled it is not illegal to murder on the open seas and walked away. It is not known why Lu believed murder was okay on the open seas. He likely watched an old gangster movie on the ship and remembered this phrase, and due to his lack of formal education, took an actor's line for real. Based on Lu's account of events, starting in May, he got together with the Mongolian clique's leader about 3 or 4 times to discuss on a course of action to take. They apparently agreed on a plan to seize control of the ship to return home, where they'd then pursue legal action against their employer. This was a poorly thought out plan from the onset, as the act of hijacking the ship is in itself an illegal act. They would have been arrested immediately upon returning to shore. By early June, a secretive group of conspirators had been formed in support of hijacking the ship home. 13 sailors were known to have initially supported the act, but only 10 of them ended up participating in the initial hijacking. Of the 10 hijackers, Wang Peng defected from the Dalian clique and joined Lu Gui Duo's group. All the hijackers were young men and new recruits on board the ship, and most of them were not licensed sailors. Soon after the ship was refueled at sea, the hijackers made their move on the night of June 16, 2011. The hijacking begun at nighttime when Captain Li was asleep. Split into 2 teams of 5, Lu Gui Duo led his group into the captain's cabin, while another group guarded the stairwell into the bridge. After busting into the captain's cabin, Lu Gui Duo immediately grabbed the captain from sleep and demanded to return home. The captain angrily rejected this demand, and Lu immediately stabbed Li's left leg with a squid knife. The captain screamed in pain, while Shuangzi followed up by hitting Li's head with a rod. Knocking him unconscious, Lu Gui Duo then instructed Shuangzi to tie up the captain, but dropped the idea after Shuangzi brought an extra thick rope and was afraid it could kill the captain. Then suddenly, 4 of the captain's men realized what went on, and rushed toward the bridge in an attempt to help. They were all unarmed, and tried to reason with the hijackers by making offers such as agreeing to sail back. This attempt turned out to be unsuccessful, and the chief officer was captured and tied up. Afterwards the other 3 retreated. Then, the tragedy begun. As if Chef Yan's prophecy came true, the replacement chef Xia Qiyang charged back toward the bridge armed with a knife while shouting, "You little rascals dare to hijack the ship?" Xia managed to charge into the bridge, but was immediately stabbed in the back twice by Zhang Xiaolong, whom he had a feud with. Xia then reached behind him and got hold of the knife's blade, but Lu Changjian broke Xia's left leg with an iron rod, causing him to fall to the floor. Zhang Xiaolong and Lu Gui Duo then proceeded to stab and cut the chief cook multiple times until he was dead, and then directed the other hijackers to throw Xia off the ship. There are now 32 sailors left on board. With Captain Li under control and Chef Xia murdered, the Dalian clique's legitimacy as employers, their primary instrument of control, had been lost. The new legitimacy on board is now decided by pure violence. The Heilongjiang clique and the Mongolian clique now have power on board the ship, at the expense of the Dalian clique. The chief officer was soon untied and granted freedom. After the murder, sailors on board gradually stopped working, but the general atmosphere was calm. Hijacker Bao Bao Cheng was said to have commented, "It's just one less person, no big deal. After we return, we'll just say he fell into the water." Things like this are common on the ocean, it'll be easy to explain. Lu Gui Duo didn't say anything, he neither agreed nor disagreed. From that point on, Lu started to behave like a different person. Later on, whenever conversations led to the deceased cook, people would refer to old Xia as a pretentious prick. The communications and AIS equipment on the bridge had been sabotaged by the hijackers. Captain Lee, now a hostage, was forced to operate the remaining satellite navigation system while hijacker Wang Peng manned the helm. The ship was turned around on the same night. The hijackers' plan was to first sail to Hawaii, and then head west towards China. It was estimated that the return trip will take 50 days. All knives on board were confiscated by the hijackers, the sole life raft was tied up with chains, and the hijackers took turns patrolling the ship in groups of 4 on rotating shifts. Special attention was paid to the captain, chief officer, and second officer. According to later interrogations, Captain Lee attempted to signal for help on a few occasions under the pretense of operating the GPS, but was ultimately unsuccessful due to the close watch being placed on him. On one rare occasion communication was established with an outside party. Lee ended up reporting all is safe and ended the transmission. Lu Guiduo and Bauta were co-leaders during this time. Lu had complete loyalty of 3 men. Bauta had 4, while 1 sailor took them both as leaders. Lu Guiduo moved into the captain's quarters. He was weary of his safety, so there were always 2 men standing on guard whenever he slept. Neutral sailors Duan Zhifang and Geng Shuijun were tasked to cook meals, while hijacking sympathizer Ma Yujiao was assigned to watch the kitchen in case food was sabotaged. For the 3 or so weeks following the initial hijacking, Lu Guiduo ceased talking to people outside the hijackers group, and at the same time forbade sailors outside the hijackers group to speak to one another. Lu was in a constant state of suspicion, always annoyed by other sailors socializing. Whenever conversation stopped with his presence, he could not help but to think that the discussion involved a rebellion against himself. Rumors about a plot to take back the ship soon circulated, coinciding with a mysterious increase in fuel consumption, and auxiliary equipment malfunctioning. Lu's reaction was very nervous, always mumbling swear words. Just as Lu was suspecting Chief Engineer Wendo of sabotaging the ship, Seaman Bo Fujun informed Lu that the captain's men were indeed plotting a revolt and tried to recruit his support. But when Lu asked for additional information, Bo retracted, and spoke a few words to defend the other side. Lu concluded that he could not trust Bo. He assumed that Bo had either joined the captain's men or is trying to play both sides. A counter-conspiracy seemed to be brewing on board and he decided to act quickly before the other side gets to do so. For this upcoming bloodshed, Lu recruited 2 young men who had previously voiced support for the hijacking but stayed reclusive during the first night's murder. This time, they're committed to act out of fear for their own safety. By the time Lu Guiduo decided to make his move, the ship had sailed to Hawaiian waters. Lu Guiduo commanded this operation from the bridge, where Captain Lee and the chief officer were tied up and watched by 2 men. Loud music was being blasted on the speakers throughout the ship as cover. Huang Jinbo started the action by luring out Chief Engineer Wendo from the lower cabin. He told Wendo there were technical issues on the bridge that only he could resolve. This move left only 2 people in the lower cabin, with 1 of 2 men asleep. 5 hijackers then entered the lower cabin, where 3 immediately controlled the second engineer Wang Yanlong. Because the third engineer Wen Mi was Wendo's cousin, he was labeled as a conspirator without questions asked and stabbed while asleep. After Wendo walked out of the bridge, he was immediately ambushed by hijackers that had just killed his cousin. Wen was stabbed and pushed into the ocean. Next, the hijackers waited outside the mid-cabin as Lu Chengjian called out victims one by one. First, Yue Peng was called out and killed. Then, Lu Gang was called out and killed. After killing Lu Gang, Lu Chengjian and Baoda entered the room and went straight toward the second officer's bed during his sleep. They immediately proceeded to stab Wang Yongbo, who woke up and fell onto the floor. Lu Guiduo soon entered the room and proceeded to stab the already injured second officer repeatedly, taunting as he stabbed. Lu said, "Aren't you the second officer? Why are your guts spilling out?" After stabbing Wang's body a few times, Lu gave orders to throw Wang offboard. Then came Jiang Shutao, who was the last of the chief engineer's friends remaining. Lu repeatedly stabbed Jiang on the main deck until Jiang pleaded, "Brother Lu, I'm sorry." Lu felt touched by Jiang's pleading, and told his men to throw Jiang into the ocean instead. After the death of Jiang, it was speculated that university graduate Ma Yujiao lost his nerve and leapt into the ocean. However, no one saw him jump. After the 6 intentional killings, it was assumed that there were 26 sailors left on board by midnight. With Ma Yujiao missing, there were actually only 25 people left on board by midnight. Lu Guiduo apparently announced to everyone that Ma Yujiao was his undercover agent, and that he shouldn't have jumped. This claim was probably a ploy used by Lu to keep other people in suspense and off balance, because by making such a claim, more people would fear who the other undercover agents are and distrust one another. Unfortunately, the killing spree continued into the early morning. Soon after midnight, Bosun Chen Guojun was pushed off the ship by Lu Guiduo. Then, Lu Guiduo gave the 2 newcomers a knife each, and instructed them to get some blood on their hands by killing the two-faced traitor Bo Fujun. Lu Guiduo then kicked the heavily wounded Bo Fujun off the ship. In the afternoon, the second officer's brother-in-law Wu Guoji was stabbed and pushed off the ship. This round of killings concluded with 22 survivors remaining on board. Almost the entire Dalian clique, the original management team, had been wiped out. All chance for restoring the old power base was reduced to null. The sudden mass killings on board disrupted the original plan to sail back home and sue the company. Even Lu Guiduo understood there was no way they could return to China by this point. Since they had just sailed past Hawaii and is nearing Japan, Lu's plan B is to illegally immigrate there. He then told the hijacking members that he had a friend in Japan who could help them get fake IDs after landing. In reality, Lu most likely didn't know anyone in Japan. This was probably another ploy to keep his followers motivated as they improvised toward an outcome. Of the 22 people still left on board, 3 belong to the original Dalian clique, 7 are still neutrals, 5 belong to the Mongolian clique, 4 belong to the Heilongjiang clique, and 3 are hijackers that are loyal to both Lu Guiduo and Bao De. A day or two following the murders, neutral sailors Shui Yang and Duan Zhifang requested to join Lu out of the fear of becoming victims themselves. Shui Yang apparently said, "Brother Lu, think of us when you need help, we'll join you." Lu neither accepted nor rejected. He first said, "I want the rest of you to go home, who knows what problems lie ahead in Japan," then said, "I'll see what happens." Again, Lu instinctively maintained an atmosphere of suspense and held others off balance. Duan Zhifang and Shui Yang thus implicitly joined the hijackers, but they declared their loyalty only to Lu. In total, the hijacker group has now ballooned to at least 14 people. It was likely at around the same time that neutral sailors Dan Guozi and Qirong Hua made a similar request to join Bao De, which would raise hijacking supporters to 16 people, but there are no survivors left to confirm this. Lu Guiduo soon gathered up all the 22 sailors on board to convene a meeting. The sole purpose of this meeting was to raise funds for the hijackers going to Japan. Lu demanded that all sailors call back home using the satellite phone on board, pretend sick, and ask family members to wire 5,000 yuan into the bank account of a female acquaintance he knew in China. Since most sailors came from poor families, 5,000 yuan in cash was a large sum. Lu's request therefore aroused much resentment, even amongst fellow hijackers such as right-hand man Zhang Xiaolong. On the afternoon of the same day, Mongol leader Bao De became suspicious of Lu's intentions and began gathering up his clique against Lu. When he approached the youngest clique member Huang Jimbo, Bao reasoned Lu's real plan is to take his closest associates to Japan, and kill off everyone else before heading ashore. As a fellow Inner Mongolian, Bao De wanted Huang to join, and Huang agreed in response. Soon after, Huang became the second informant. Lu had befriended Huang Jimbo early in the trip, with Huang looking up to Lu and viewing him as an elderly brother. As expected, Huang quickly found Lu and said there was something important he needed to know. Before Huang even got to explain, Lu asked, "Bao De wants to kill me, doesn't he?" The surprised Huang nodded his head. After Huang confirmed Bao De's intentions, Lu concluded that he needed both the help and bait value of the imprisoned captain. Lu said to the captain, I have 7 or 8 lives on my hands right now, whoever wants to live on this ship must soil their hands with blood as well. Lu also lied to the captain that it was Bao who killed Second Officer Wang Yongbo, whom the captain had known for 10 years, even though it was actually Lu who had stabbed Wang repeatedly. Captain Li ended up agreeing to join Lu's clique against Bao out of fear for his own safety. He probably knew about Lu's involvement in the second officer's death, but chose to believe in a lie anyways as the belief itself can protect him. By this time, Lu's clique now numbered 8 people, while Bao is down to 4 people after the betrayal of Wang Jingbo. 3 other hijackers have not decided whether to follow Lu or Bao at this point, although Mei Linsheng is inclined to listen to Lu. By this time, the ship had sailed near Japan. On the night of July 24, 2011, Lu gathered up his followers and gave each member a paper slip containing names of the 4 people to be killed that night. He then gave new member Shui Yang a squid knife, and instructed him to be on standby inside the cabin. Shui Yang will be called out later to act as the bait. New member Captain Li was instructed to wait on the deck with a knife. Lu Gui Duo was weary of entrusting this task solely to the 2 new members, so he tasked Lu Changjian and Huang Jinbo to oversee the actions on deck. With Lu's men in position on deck, he then found excuses to take knives away from 2 of Bao's men. While tasking Zhang Xiaolong and Mei Linsheng to secretly guard the cabin's entrance. Then, Lu Gui Duo personally approached Bao and lied saying Captain Li wants to join, but he had to first kill Shui Yang as a proof of loyalty. The captain will need to borrow Bao's knife in order to carry out the killing. Bao agreed to Lu's plan and handed Lu his knife. As per Lu's instructions, Bao went to the cabin and called Shui Yang out. Shui Yang then followed Bao onto the deck with a knife hidden behind his back. Once on deck, Bao found himself sandwiched between Shui Yang and Captain Li, who each had a knife on hand against the unarmed Bao. The duo wasted no time and immediately started to stab Bao from front and back. Seeing the action started, the 2 watchmen joined as well. Bao was chased around the deck by 4 knife-wielding men and stabbed repeatedly. Out of desperation, Bao called out to his men for help, but nobody dared to come. New member Shui Yang was especially vicious in his attacks. He even smeared Bao's blood onto his face, while jubilantly shouting, "I have blood! I have blood!" as if his initiation ceremony into the hijackers is complete and his own safety is now guaranteed. Unable to bear the stabbing, Bao finally jumped into the ocean. After Bao fell into the water, the ship's speakerphone was switched on, and Lu was heard saying, "Who did you think Wang Jingbo worked for? Who else dares to go against me? Who else is part of your group?" Bao's remaining close supporters were soon forced to jump off the ship as well. There are now 18 survivors left on board the ship. Power within the hijackers are reshuffled, and Lu Gui Duo became the undisputed ruler. The 2 wavering hijackers Feng Xingyan and Mei Linsheng now had only one leader to follow. Due to unknown reasons, Ding Yiman remained distanced from the rest of the hijackers, despite having joined the hijacking since day 1, possibly due to desperate leaks of secrets by Bao and his followers. Lu Gui Duo decided to kill neutral sailors Dan Guozi and Qirong Hua on the same night. Qirong Hua was first called out from the lower cabin by Lu. Stabbed repeatedly, and forced to jump off. Dan Guozi was then called out from the bow cabin. Stabbed repeatedly, and forced to jump off. By the end of July 24, there were 16 sailors left on board. By now, there were only 1 distinction of groups on board: 1, those who have blood on their hands; 2, those who do not have blood on their hands. Before daybreak on July 25, second engineer Wang Yanlong secretly opened up an undersea valve in the engine room, which flooded the engine room, gradually disabling the ship's engines and resulted in slow sinking. Wang is suspected to have leapt off the ship without taking along any supplies. Nobody had seen him ever since. With the disappearance of Wang Yanlong, There are now 15 sailors left on board. When Captain Lee woke up in the morning, he noticed something odd about the ship. The ship was listing and appeared to be moving slower in the water. After heading down into the engine room, Lee immediately knew the undersea valve had been opened by Wang Yanlong and quickly informed Lu Gui Duo about the situation. To their horror, the second engineer was nowhere to be found on the ship. Only the engineers on board knew where the undersea valve is located. Now with 2 deceased and 1 missing, nobody left on board knows how to close it. With the engine room half flooded, it is impossible to attempt to find the valve now. In an act of desperation, Lu Gui Duo instructed 4 sailors to build a makeshift raft with whatever wood planks, ropes and nails they could salvage on the ship. It is worth noting that the 4 sailors assigned to build this raft are the 4 people who are most detached from the hijacking group. Perhaps by this time Lu didn't want to assign menial work to his followers. While the raft was being built, Lu and Captain Lee returned to the bridge and restored the communications equipment that were initially sabotaged. When they contacted government authorities, they reported the number of people on board as 15. While Lu was preoccupied on the bridge, the 4 sailors had completed the makeshift raft and stockpiled some essential survival provisions onto it. Unbeknownst to the hijackers, the 4 who built the raft decided to use this opportunity to escape the ship. Their plan was to float in the vicinity in the next few days while the authorities are on their way to the rescue. Now a new group of 4 has been formed, centered around the chief officer Fu Yizhuang, whom despite having 20 years of friendship with Captain Lee had lost faith in what's to come. The raft's absence was not discovered until it had floated a good distance away. After Lu Gui Duo found out about this, he ran toward the bow of the ship and started shouting, "Fuck you! You motherfucker!" He first frantically walked around the deck, and then sat down, appearing crestfallen. After some time afloat, those on board the ship realized water had stopped flooding in. By this time, there aren't many stores and squids left on board, and the ship was light. Besides the disabled engine, they seemed to be able to float indefinitely until help arrived. Suddenly, Captain Lee told everyone to duck down. He noticed that the drift anchor deployed by the ship is allowing them to slowly catch up to the raft. Soon there was a loud thump heard at the bow and the raft was back to the ship. When the hijackers looked over the bow, the raft-bound sailors were attempting to cut the drift anchor rope with kitchen knives. Suddenly, all the hijackers stood up and Lu Gui Duo instructed his followers to bring up steel squid jigging weights. Soon there were close to 100 steel weights stacked on deck. By now, Captain Lee seemed to have long abandoned the 20-year-long friendship he had with Chief Officer Fu Yizhuang. To some people's surprise, it was Lee who first gave the order for everybody throw the weights toward Fu Yizhuang and others. Soon, all 4 men were injured and 3 men jumped into the water to swim away. Zhang Xiaolong was especially angry at Ding Yiman, an initial hijacker, for betraying the hijacking group. He proceeded to jump onto the raft with a squid spear and stab Ding Yiman into the water. Fu Yizhuang, Ding Yiman and Gong Shuijun both pleaded and swore at the hijackers on board as they gradually swam away from the ship. The 3 of them were last seen huddled together in the water bleeding. The 4th sailor, Song Guochun, pleaded for his life while remaining close to the ship. He was eventually pulled up onto the deck. There are now 12 survivors on board. By this time Captain Lee had totally turned. He took the initiative and pointed out sailors Duan Zhifang and Xiong Lishan haven't committed murder yet, and cannot be trusted to join until they had dipped their hands in blood as well. As soon as Xiong Lishan heard this, he immediately picked up a knife and ready to stab Song Guochun. In a surprising move, Lu Gui Duo told him to put down the knife. Lu then said, "You two can just tie him up and push him off." This was a conditional acknowledgement to formally accept Duan Zhifang and Xiong Lishan into the group. Wanting to live, the two had no other choice but to tie up Song Guochun and add weights to his body. Song Guo-chun was the last person to die on board the ship, and all 11 survivors have committed murder. A blood pact is thus formed, and all members had a reason to mislead authorities in the upcoming interrogations. A vessel from the China Fisheries Law Enforcement is less than a week away, under the assumption there's 15 people on board. Since there's now only 11 people left, they had a lot of explaining to do. Most time was spent in the following days discussing on the best lies to tell authorities. The clique was optimistic since all members have murdered people, and thus had incentives to hide their crime. A final script of the mutually agreed string of events was written on paper, and each member had a copy for memorization and recitation before the authorities arrived. The final script placed all blame on Bauda and his followers, who are said to have escaped on a makeshift raft after authorities were confirmed to be coming their way. In an effort to enforce more loyalty, Lu Guiduo wrote down everybody's home addresses and threatened to find any traitors. The YV001E vessel from the China Fisheries Law Enforcement arrived about a week later on August 1, 2011. The authorities first boarded the vessel both to do medical checks and to perform a head count. Captain Lee quietly slid a paper slip into an officer's hand, saying it is a summary of everything that had occurred on board. While they were being towed back, all evidence of crime had been thrown into the sea, followed by a thorough cleanup of the ship. Every corner of the Lu Rongyu had been meticulously wiped for bloodstains. They returned to Shidao port about 2 weeks later. The paper slip that Captain Lee had passed to the fisheries officer didn't help. Sailors were immediately greeted by armed police officers at the dock. All 11 sailors were immediately cuffed and made to board a bus. After the bus drove to a less visible area, many more police officers appeared out of nowhere. The 11 sailors were then separated and transferred individually to the police station. During initial interrogations, all 11 suspects collectively recited the same script that was agreed upon. However, given a conjured story, differences in memories, and general weaknesses in human nature, the police were soon able to make progress. The first suspect to betray the recited story was Huang Jimbo, who was the youngest sailor on board. Afterwards, all the suspects gradually gave in to the truth one by one, with the exception of Lu Guiduo. Lu purportedly denied all accusations against himself and held out till the very end. After investigations and judicial proceedings, different sentencings were given to the 11 hijackers. The 5 sailors, Lu Guiduo, Lu Chengjian, left-hand man, Zhang Xiaolong, right-hand man, Huang Jimbo, the youngest sailor, and Captain Li Chengquan were sentenced to death. Wang Peng, who steered the ship after hijacking, received a death sentence with 2 years probation. Feng Xingyan, one of the only 2 Southerners on the ship, was given a life sentence. The 2 latecomers Mei Linsheng and Shui Yang were sentenced to 15 years in prison. Xiang Lishan, the oldest sailor on board, was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Duan Zhifang, whom Lu Guiduo liked the most and tried to keep out of the violence, was sentenced to 4 years in prison. During imprisonment, Lu attempted to convince a fellow death row cellmate to jailbreak. He was reported by the cellmate on the next day. Lu subsequently spent the last 5 years of his jail life with 4 limbs restrained to a bed. Lu's death sentence was carried out in the year 2016. This concludes the Lu Rongyu 2682 tragedy. There are many classic representations of power and social dynamics to be learned from this tragic story. We will briefly summarize here the 3 primary takeaways. Takeaway number 1, a classic example relating to the usurping of power was played out on board the Lu Rongyu. Power usurpation typically involves 4 steps of killings, or eliminations in lawful and peaceful environments. Number 1. Eliminating the instrument of power used by the ruling class. This was achieved by killing the chief cook Xia Qiyang, which resulted in the management team's loss of control over the crew. The first killing on board nullified the contractual relationship between the crew and the company, and the new power base that replaced it is legitimized by the ability to exert violence and kill. Number 2. Eliminating past supporters of the ex-ruling class, killing the captain's men removed any threat of the old power being reinstated. Preventing counter-rebellion from the old power base against the usurpers. Number 3. Eliminating internal rivalries amongst the usurpers themselves. The new status quo sits on flimsy foundations, power is justified through killings, and such an atmosphere sows mistrust. There was little guarantee of safety amongst the rebels themselves, as life and death rested solely on the whims of men. What made it worse was there were two leaders amongst the rebels, each of whom had their own clique. Safety for one's own life will thus only be achieved by following the established precedents, to kill the other. Number 4. Eliminating those who attempt to flee from the new ruling class. Besides active rebellions through violence, there's also a way to passively rebel via non-participation. One way to do this is by physically escaping the rule of those in power. The act of doing this will demoralize those who stay, and encourage more escapes. It is then necessary for the usurper to eliminate those who attempted to escape, brand them as traitors to the revolution, and leverage the occasion to set an example for those who are still on board. Takeaway number 2, power comes from your ability to perpetually keep others off balance. When compared to the other sailors on board, YV001E was only at average height, relatively skinny, and did not begin the trip with many allies. So how did he manage to influence people and seize control of power? Lu consistently controlled the pace of the game by deliberately injecting intrigue into the atmosphere, while actively pursued to be the first one to act on something new and unexpected. Through purchasing the maximum amount of cigarettes on credit from the company, Lu monopolized the cigarette supply on board. Lu gained a better position at winning people's favors for the remainder of the trip. By stabbing Captain Lee, Lu nullified the employment contract's control over the crew and replaced it with his personal ability to dictate the exertion of violence. The unexpected suicide of university graduate Ma Yuzhao was leveraged by Lu to intimidate others on board. Lu immediately told everyone that Ma was his secret spy, forcing others to guess and distrust one another. In preparation for the plan to go to Japan, Lu lied to the crew about a friend in Japan who can help with fake IDs. This act kept up the hopes for his supporters as Lu continued to improvise and setting the pace for what's to come next. Takeaway number 3, avoid confined situations, for it draws the strongest evil out of the most ordinary people. The 33 sailors that begun the trip were free of criminal records, but ended with 16 sailors having participated in murder and only 11 survivors remaining. How did this occur? People are territorial by nature, and are conditioned to create comfort zones through seeking abundant physical space and the freedom of choice for socialization. When space is lacking, both physically and socially, there will be more instances of people seeking the same things. When conflict unavoidably erupts between people, the closed environment offers no opportunities for maneuvering out, and you're forced back to dealing with the person you had fallen out with. The overall atmosphere will gravitate towards a zero-sum game mentality. Human nature will encourage aggression and mutual sabotage in such an environment. When exacerbated by isolation with the outside world and government authorities, there was little short-term repercussions for committing violence, and eventually murder, on board the YV001E 2682. Thank you for watching. Please make sure to check out our book in the link below. We will take you on a journey of alternative views on human nature.